There was a moment, not long ago, when I caught myself wondering who I really was beneath all the layers I'd built over time. It wasn't a fleeting thought, but a persistent whisper that grew louder with each passing day. I realized I'd been living through a version of myself sculpted more by fear than by my true essence. It hit me unexpectedly during a quiet afternoon, sitting alone with my thoughts, when I asked myself, is this really me, or just a collection of habits I picked up to keep anxiety at bay? It's strange, isn't it? How some parts of us feel so natural, so ingrained, that we never question them. The quietness, the caution, the urge to control, those traits we assume come from who we are deep inside. But what if they aren't the whole truth? What if over time, anxiety whispered suggestions so subtle they became indistinguishable from our identities? I started thinking about all the moments I chose silence instead of speaking up, all the times I avoided risk not because I wanted to, but because fear told me that was safer. These weren't just harmless preferences. They were shields, carefully crafted to protect a vulnerable part of me I wasn't even fully aware of. I remember once during a group project, my voice was barely a murmur when others dominated the conversation. Someone asked for my opinion, and I froze, fumbling for words that felt brave enough to escape. Afterwards, I told myself, I'm just naturally reserved. But deep down, I suspected something else was at play. There was this gnawing feeling that the quiet version of me was less about choice and more about avoiding being judged or misunderstood. It wasn't who I wanted to be, but it had become a safe space where anxiety couldn't easily reach me. This realization was unsettling and yet strangely liberating. It opened the door to a part of me I had long ignored. What fascinated me was the subtlety of this transformation. No sudden changes or dramatic shifts. The personality I knew was like a sculpture shaped by invisible hands. Anxiety nudging me to speak less here, to plan more there, to hide feelings that felt risky. Over time, these nudges snowballed into a persona that fit a mold of safety, but not necessarily truth. I wasn't brave all at once, but brave enough to look closer and question what lay underneath the surface. That process led me through memories I'd tucked away, the worried nights spent rehearsing conversations, the social events I skipped because my thoughts whispered, better not risk it. The moments I clenched my jaw to hold back tears or anger. I realized these responses weren't fleeting. They had coiled themselves into the daily rhythm of my life like invisible chains disguised as routines. They created a version of myself that felt acceptable, but also constrained. Anxiety had built walls around me, walls I had mistaken for my own. As I looked deeper, I started to see others around me, friends, family, the stranger on the bus, carrying their own adaptations shaped by fear. Some masked restlessness with perfectionism, others forced smiles over their quiet desperation. It made me wonder how many of us wander through life wearing these layers to survive, not realizing how much they alter who we believe we are. It's a collective dance, almost unnoticed, where anxiety leads and we follow, often unaware. Yet, despite the weight of these layers, part of me still knew there was something untouched beneath. The person I was before fear took the wheel. A more spontaneous, less guarded self, eager but cautious, who longed for connection without needing to retreat. That part felt distant, like a faded photograph buried deep in a drawer, dusty but precious. I started asking myself, what if this isn't about changing who I am? What if it's about rediscovering who I was before fear crafted this safe shell? What if I didn't have to tear down my entire self, but simply learn to live beyond the constraints anxiety had written on it? This journey felt less like a battle and more like a gentle unveiling. I wasn't seeking to erase my quietness or caution, but to understand their roots, whether they sprouted from calm certainty or trembling fear. I felt, for the first time, that maybe the anxiety that shaped certain parts of me wasn't an enemy to defeat, but a signal to listen to understand, and then to gently move beyond. If you've ever wondered about the parts of yourself that feel so familiar, yet somehow distant, a voice too soft, a heart too cautious, a control too tight, you're not alone. We've all carried these subtle shapes of anxiety, wearing them as if they were our true faces. But what if they're more like masks, comforting but hiding the skin beneath? I want to tell you this story because it's a turning point, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever felt imprisoned within their own personality. There's a subtle power in recognizing these layers, in understanding that who you are isn't fixed or limited to what you've adapted to survive. There's a space waiting for you beyond fear, where your true self quietly waits, ready to breathe again. As I share this, I invite you to look inward with me, to explore the corners of your own story where anxiety has shaped your way of being. Let's walk through this together, with curiosity, compassion, and hope, toward a place where who we are and who we want to be can finally start to align. The journey isn't about abandoning yourself. It's about coming home to yourself, beyond protection and fear. And that is where everything begins. The evening air hung heavy as I sat on the park bench, watching shadows lengthen around me. I'd always considered myself someone who preferred quiet corners, a gentle observer rather than the center of attention. Yet, recently, a flicker of doubt stirred within. Was my silence truly a choice, or merely an echo of caution ingrained by unease? That night, a whispered conversation with a close friend cracked open a door I hadn't known was locked so tight. She spoke candidly about her own struggles with social anxiety, the invisible weight that shaped her every encounter. Sometimes, she said, it's not about being shy or introverted. It's about the stories I tell myself to stay safe. Her words hit me with unexpected force, revealing how much our internal narratives sculpt our outward presence. I realized then that my reserved manner might be less about personality and more about protection, a complex choreography of responses designed to anticipate and avoid discomfort. I began to notice nuances in my behavior that had slipped past my awareness. When a group laughed too loudly, I'd retreat inward, shrinking to a smaller physical space, lowering my gaze. At work, I meticulously planned conversations, rehearsing phrases so I could sidestep potential missteps. These actions weren't random. They were acts of subtle self-defense, a strategy of containment crafted by an underlying tension I rarely acknowledged. During this time, I met a man named Daniel, someone whose calm confidence was magnetic. At first, his openness made me uneasy, as if my carefully built walls might crumble under his gentle gaze. Yet, as our conversations deepened, I found myself disclosing thoughts I'd kept locked away for years. One evening, under a canopy of stars, he said, "Have you ever wondered whether some parts of you exist because you truly embrace them, or because holding on protects you?" The question lingered between us, heavy and revealing. That night, lying awake, I peeled back each familiar response like the layers of an onion. I examined my tendencies not as fixed traits, but as patterns born from learned behaviors. How often had I framed myself through the lens of caution, believing it was just who I was? How many opportunities for connection had I sidestepped fearing judgment or rejection? The realization wasn't just intellectual. It stirred something primal, a yearning for freedom from invisible chains. In the following weeks, I practiced observing my impulses without immediate reaction. When the urge to withdraw surfaced, I instead tried leaning in, sensing the discomfort but refusing to let it dictate my choices. The process resembled a dance between fear and curiosity, one step back, two steps forward. Conversations became experiments in authenticity rather than rehearsed scripts. Slowly, the tight grip of hesitation loosened, revealing glimpses of a bolder self. One afternoon, during a spontaneous lunch with colleagues, I caught myself laughing freely at a joke without second-guessing. The sensation was unfamiliar but exhilarating. I recognized that moments like this weren't just random acts of lightness. They were victories, proof that beneath the caution lay a reservoir of genuine expression waiting to be tapped. This emerging self wasn't a complete reinvention, but rather a reclaiming of parts I'd tucked away. Conversely, I noticed how old habits still surfaced, especially in stressful situations. On a particularly demanding day, when a project meeting became heated, my instinct pushed towards silence and retreat. But instead of succumbing, I took a breath and voiced a concern with measured calm. The words surprised not only those around me, but me as well. In that moment, I glimpsed the fragile but growing bridge between survival instincts and conscious choice. Each of these experiences taught me that personality is less a static blueprint and more a living tapestry, continually woven by our interactions with inner emotions and external realities. Anxiety doesn't merely influence behavior. It can shape entire modes of relating to the world, sometimes in ways we mistake for innate character. Understanding this unveiled a deeper compassion for my past self, who did her best with the tools she had, even if those tools were forged in tension. I began journaling these shifts, not to catalog failures or achievements, but to honor the subtle transformations. Writing became an archive of courage, documenting moments when I opted vulnerability over concealment. Through stories and reflections, I discovered that reintegration isn't an overnight fix, but a gentle unfolding, like dawn breaking slowly across the horizon. Now, consider how this applies when you face moments that beckon retreat. The critical glance from a stranger, the unexpected silence after sharing a thought, the internal dialogue spinning fear into false certainties. Can you sense beneath those reactions a protective script written long ago? What if, instead of suppressing or dismissing these feelings, you allowed yourself to trace their origins with kindness? In that space of curiosity, you may find the first threads of a new narrative, one that welcomes both vulnerability and strength. This journey is not about discarding all defense. Rather, it is about discerning which ways of being serve growth and which confine potential. As I continue to navigate this terrain, I hold close the hope that each step beyond entrenched patterns is a step toward a fuller, more authentic life. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of deep mauve and amber, I found myself caught in a conversation that stirred a different kind of unease, one that wasn't about fear of judgment or social scrutiny, but about the very way I held space for my emotions. It dawned on me how often I had internalized a rigid form of self-control, a subtle imprisonment where feelings were locked behind tightly sealed doors. This guarded self wasn't merely a protective measure against external threats. It had gradually become a barrier between me and my own emotional landscape. I recalled a moment when a close friend shared a personal loss. As she wept, I instinctively softened my gaze, hardened my posture, suppressing a sudden swell of emotion inside. I wished to comfort her, yet simultaneously, part of me recoiled from vulnerability, afraid that displaying my own feelings might unravel the delicate balance of composure I maintained daily. It struck me then that the compartments I'd created to shield myself had inadvertently dulled not only my pain, but also my capacity for authentic connection. Weeks later, during a spirited debate at a community gathering, I noticed my voice shrinking, my words measured and cautious. Unlike before, this retreat wasn't motivated solely by apprehension toward others' reactions, but by an ingrained tendency to tightly regulate any expression that might betray discomfort or weakness. I realized the self I projected was frequently filtered through this lens of emotional moderation, a mechanism designed not only to avoid chaos, but to maintain a fragile sense of order within. This newfound recognition unleashed a torrent of conflicting thoughts. How had I equated vulnerability with instability? In what ways did this emotional containment limit my experiences of joy, grief, or exhilaration? The protective script written into my neural pathways started to reveal cracks, tiny fissures through which genuine feelings strained to emerge. Grappling with this paradox, between safety and authenticity, became a silent struggle waged within my mind. One afternoon, compelled by a restless impulse, I ventured into an art class. The instructor encouraged us to paint without judgment, to allow the brush to flow freely. As I dipped into vibrant colors, sensations long subdued began surfacing with surprising intensity. Shadows of sadness, flickers of hope, bursts of laughter trapped beneath the surface. In that messy, colorful chaos, I glimpsed a version of myself unburdened by rigid control, raw and alive in its imperfections. Amid this experience, I remembered a phrase from a book I'd once skimmed. Healing isn't linear, it's a spiral. That struck a chord. Progress wasn't about eradicating caution, but about learning to coexist with it without silencing the deeper currents of emotion. I understood that my relationship with feeling had been shaped by a fear of overwhelm, but true resilience demanded willingness to embrace emotional tides, even when unpredictable. Not every moment felt comfortable. Sometimes sensations flooded unexpectedly, leaving me momentarily vulnerable. Yet, these moments bore the unmistakable texture of growth. One evening, during a phone call home, I shared these insights candidly with my sibling. I'm learning that holding back too much doesn't protect me. It walls me off, I said haltingly. They responded with warmth, recalling seeing a side of me that was more animated, unguarded, and curious. Their words reminded me how often I had dimmed my own light, convinced that camouflage was the safest choice. In this unfolding story, an essential truth revealed itself. Our relationship to emotions often reflects survival strategies honed in response to unseen wounds. The ability to express feelings openly isn't simply a sign of bravery, but a necessary act of reclaiming wholeness. When I allowed myself to inhabit those emotions more fully, I experienced a richness of life previously hidden beneath layers of restraint. Now, reflect for a moment on your own emotional habits. Do you find yourself retreating behind controlled expressions when vulnerability beckons? Can you recognize moments when numbing or restriction dulls the vibrancy of your inner world? There's tenderness in acknowledging these patterns. It's an invitation to tender self-care rather than judgment. Imagining your feelings as a garden help me cultivate patience. Some areas may be scorched or overgrown. Others flourish with surprising resilience. By gently tending to each part, allowing grief to fall like autumn leaves, joy to bloom like spring flowers, you nurture a terrain where true presence takes root. This approach doesn't reject caution, but balances it with courageous openness. In weaving these threads of emotional exploration, I discovered that personal evolution isn't about discarding every safeguard, but about transforming them, turning shields into bridges that connect rather than isolate. The courage to feel deeply becomes a conduit to fuller self-expression, richer relationships, and profound healing. Though the path is rarely smooth, each step into authenticity creates space for the person who's been waiting patiently beneath layers of restraint to emerge and thrive. There was a moment during a late afternoon walk when the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the city streets. I found myself drawn into a lively cafe, bustling with voices and laughter, yet somehow I felt a persistent tug to stay invisible, an urge that wasn't about shyness but something deeper, an internal voice warning that exposure might lead to discomfort. Sitting at a corner table, I watched a group of friends effortlessly exchange stories, their expressions open and unguarded. The contrast between their ease and my guarded presence sparked a troubling question. What parts of my character were adaptations forged not from choice, but from repeated attempts to sidestep unease? Delving into this, I started to notice how my interactions often revolved around calculated safety nets. For instance, I would intentionally steer conversations toward neutral topics, avoiding vulnerability that risked eliciting judgment. This pattern, I realized, stemmed from ingrained survival instincts, a rehearsed dance to maintain emotional stability. It was as if I carried an internal script, written through countless moments of self-protection, that dictated when to speak, when to silence, and when to withdraw entirely. Recognizing this was both unsettling and enlightening, as it highlighted the extent to which my natural responses had been shaped by the anticipation of anxiety's grip. One afternoon, a colleague invited me to collaborate on an unscripted brainstorming session. The lack of structure was intimidating. I instinctively feared making a misstep or revealing something undesirable. Yet, I also sensed this was a chance to observe the unfiltered space between the lines of my carefully constructed demeanor. Tentatively, I offered an idea that diverged from the group's flow. The moment stretched, in a suspended breath, before a nod of acceptance encouraged more openness. Through this simple experience, I glimpsed how the layers armored by apprehension could be peeled away, revealing spontaneous impulses that felt startlingly authentic but fragile. Shifting from observations to inner perception, I began to trace bodily sensations linked to this constant state of vigilance. The tightness in my chest during social gatherings, the quickened pulse when considering stepping outside my comfort zone. These physiological markers formed an atlas of fear-written behavior patterns. Learning to attune to these sensations allowed me to differentiate between instinctive reactions and deliberate choices. Over time, I learned to soften this grasp, acknowledging that uncertainty could coexist with strength. Embracing small acts of unpredictability, like impromptu plans or admitting doubt, became exercises in cultivating trust within myself and the world around me. One vivid memory stands out. At a family celebration, I caught myself about to correct the story someone told, out of a need to maintain accuracy and avoid embarrassment. In that instant, I paused and chose instead to smile and listen without interruption. This seemingly minor decision symbolized a breakthrough, the willingness to loosen the reins on control, inviting imperfect connection over rigid correctness. The relief that followed was palpable. It was as though I had stepped out from behind a veil, allowing a more vibrant version of myself to emerge into the room. Fascinated, I began journaling these shifts, chronicling not victories or failures, but observations about the space between my default responses and emerging openness. I invited curiosity into moments of discomfort rather than retreat. This practice revealed that what once seemed like fixed personality traits could be fluid, shaped as much by vulnerability as by fear's imprint. It underscored a profound truth, that transformation unfolds not through forceful rewiring, but through compassionate witnessing and willingness to explore the unknown edges of self. Now, think about your own habitual responses in relationships or situations that provoke uneasiness. Can you detect which behaviors stem from a protective impulse? What sensations or thoughts accompany these patterns? By dialoguing with these parts without criticism, you might discover avenues to gently expand your range of expression. The path won't always be straight, but every moment you choose curiosity over avoidance, you create room for a fuller, less constrained story to take shape. This unfolding is an invitation to meet yourself beyond the cautions etched by years of anxious rhythm, and to step into the possibility of authentic presence waiting quietly to be embraced. Late one night, beneath a sky swirled with restless clouds, I found myself wrestling with a revelation that shifted my understanding completely. It wasn't merely a question of surface behaviors shaped by unease. It was the profound way anxiety had folded itself into my decision-making, shrinking my world from infinite possibility to a narrow corridor of careful choices. I recall vividly the heaviness that settled in my chest during a social invitation I almost declined, not because I lacked interest, but because the imagined what-ifs and could-best played like a relentless loop inside my mind. The options I believed available were filtered heavily by a protective lens that distorted risk as something entirely catastrophic. In this moment, I realized anxiety had not only affected the way I acted outwardly, it had infiltrated the architecture of my very choices. I suddenly saw how much energy I unconsciously devoted to preemptively steering clear of uncertainty, painting over spontaneity with layers of cautious planning. Reflecting on this, I recognized how my everyday trajectory resembled a carefully tended garden with hedges insulated against disruption. The hedges, though comforting, confined me to familiar pathways, denying my roots the chance to explore uncharted soil. A poignant memory emerged from a day when my sister invited me on a last-minute road trip. Almost instinctively, my mind sprinted through every potential hurdle: a flat tire in the middle of nowhere, running out of gas, feeling ill on the road, speaking in unfamiliar places. The accumulation of what-ifs convinced me to politely decline. Her gentle disappointment stuck with me longer than the excuse I offered. It was then I understood how anxiety's reach extended far beyond isolated moments, affecting life's broader canvas by steering me into narrow zones of predictability. Yet, resisting this grip became a subtle revolution. I started experimenting with small compromises, agreeing to impromptu meetups, allowing myself to decline the urge to overplan trips, trying to welcome the unknown as a canvas instead of a wilderness full of threats. These acts weren't grand, but offered powerful counterpoints to my usual patterns. An urge to engage with life outside my familiar script started unveiling itself like a candle flickering in an enclosed room, throwing dancing light across shadowed corners of my being. During one of these outings, on a chilly evening illuminated by city lights, I struck up a conversation with a stranger who shared stories of his own battles with anxiety. He spoke about how his desire for control often led to exhaustion, not safety. I realized, he said, that controlling everything is like holding onto a rope frayed by strain. At some point, it snaps, and I'm left without support. His metaphor painted a powerful image I held onto: the idea that defense mechanisms, when stretched beyond endurance, become liabilities rather than shields. Inspired, I found myself observing how anxiety had also influenced my emotional expression and relationships. I recalled a moment with a close friend where I waited days before articulating a worry, fearing that revealing vulnerability might create distance. That silence, meant to protect the connection, ironically created a chasm. Understanding this irony was a painful revelation, a paradox where my attempts to safeguard intimacy quietly eroded it. Recognizing this dynamic fueled a desire to practice openness, risking discomfort to invite genuine closeness. At that point, I began crafting new rituals that encouraged presence and responsiveness. For example, I started sending spontaneous messages of appreciation or curiosity, small gestures that challenged my ingrained tendencies to hold back until conditions felt perfect. Sometimes my heart pounded fiercely as I hit send, but with each message, the walls built from caution chipped a little. This gradual erosion made space for a freer flow of expression, offering glimpses of connections unclouded by unseen filters. Another transformation emerged as I examined how anxiety shaped my belief in personal potential. It had tempted me into accepting limitations as fixed facts instead of challenges ripe with possibility. Remembering a morning jog during an early spring thaw, when my legs protested and doubts whispered that I was not built for this, I consciously chose to reframe the narrative. Rather than a verdict on ability, it became a signal inviting persistence. Repeatedly choosing to challenge those inner voices sparked a shift. Where fear once hemmed me in, courage began carving new horizons. In dealing with these revelations, I recognized the importance of gentleness. Progress was often uneven, marked with days when old patterns clawed back fiercely. Yet, embracing setbacks as part of growth rather than defeat nurtured resilience. I reminded myself that dismantling years of defensive wiring wasn't a sprint, but a series of mindful steps opening doors to unexplored facets of myself. I encourage you now to consider moments when your own decisions seemed dictated more by avoidance than desire. What hidden narrowings shape your path? Can you imagine loosening the grip of fear to invite possibility into the dance of your choices? This awareness is a gateway, not to reckless abandon, but to a richer, more expansive way of inhabiting life, where hesitation softens and your true preferences emerge with clarity and power. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the cafe window in golden shards, warming the wooden table where I sat, notebook open but untouched. Across from me, Maya's eyes shimmered with a quiet intensity as she leaned forward, sharing stories that wove effortlessly between joy and sorrow. Her openness was magnetic. I couldn't help but notice how freely she navigated her emotions, inviting vulnerability as though it were an old friend. Watching her, a question surfaced. Instead of building walls around feelings, why did I instinctively construct invisible barricades, fragmenting my experience like shattered glass? My mind traveled back to a recent family gathering where laughter buzzed thickly in the air. I held a secret beneath my smile, a cautious suppression of bitterness that stirred whenever criticism brushed too close. Yet, I masked it swiftly, fearing the ripple effect that honesty might cause. Maya's ease contrasted sharply with my guarded nature, prompting me to wonder if this protective armor fragmented my ability to truly connect. Could the grip of relentless self-restraint dull the very colors that make human connection vivid and alive? Later, as we strolled through a narrow alley teeming with street art, a piece caught my eye. A mural depicting a bird with broken wings, poised on the brink of flight. The artist's brushstrokes pulsed with energy, yet bore marks of struggle and imperfection. It struck me, my emotions, when tightly confined, might be like that bird, hesitant to soar because the scars of restraint weighed heavily. Yet those very marks told a story not only of pain, but of resilience and immense potential. The image stayed with me, an emblem urging me to reconsider how I held my feelings captive beneath layers of control. One evening unfolded differently. A close friend confessed she felt detached, describing how she lived with an internal pressure to appear composed, suppressing authentic emotion so others wouldn't worry. Her confession echoed unspoken truths ringing in my chest. We sat silently for a moment, acknowledging the invisible burden each of us carried, the silent ledger of suppressed tears, muffled laughter, and hidden fears. These emotional tolls hadn't vanished. They simply collected, a quiet sediment beneath everyday interactions. Inspired to explore this further, I began a ritual of daily reflection, not in the usual journal form, but through recording voice memos. Speaking aloud felt strange at first, exposing vulnerable thoughts to the emptiness of a room rather than confining them to private pages. But gradually, this practice became a rehearsal for emotional honesty, forcing me to hear, accept, and even embrace raw feelings without quick judgment. Sometimes my voice trembled or faltered, and often, an ache echoed beneath my cadence. Yet facing these sounds nurtured an unexpected tenderness toward myself. One memory crystallized amid this process. A rainy afternoon when I sat by the window, watching drops slide down glass panes like slow tears escaping from the sky. I allowed sadness to surface fully, without negating or moderating it. The liberation surprised me. Through these moments, I learned that embracing emotional waves requires courage, not recklessness. I discovered that feeling deeply nourishes creativity, empathy, and connection, transforming vulnerability from liability into strength. The impact rippled into relationships. With colleagues, I started to share not only facts but also subtle shades of how challenges affected me. There was an unexpected lightness, a softening in interactions where previously stiffness reigned. A coworker, once distant, confided about his own struggles, creating a bridge between us previously absent. Emotion became less of a forbidden language and more a dynamic rhythm weaving threads of compassion and shared humanity. In one striking conversation, a mentor said, "Our greatest breakthroughs often arise from stepping into discomfort, not away from it." Those words echoed in my mind during moments when instinct urged retreat, but I chose advance. Through trial and error, I realized emotional openness doesn't imply surrendering control wholesale. Instead, it's a practiced balance, knowing when to hold steady and when to yield. The paradox is profound, teaching me resilience blossoms in that delicate interplay. Now, imagine your own internal landscape. Are there valleys filled with untended feelings, quiet spaces where you've stored away fragments to keep safe? Bringing those hidden places into light requires patience, kindness, and gentle insistence. What would happen if, in those moments of hesitation, you allowed yourself to plumb the depth of sensation instead of skimming the surface? The path toward integration is neither linear nor tidy. It unfolds like a wild river cutting through rock, revealing beauty in its unpredictable course. Such realization opened my perspective on self-expression itself. Artistic pursuits, once confined to technical perfectionism, transformed into playgrounds for emotional exploration. I found new freedom in painting abstract shapes and vibrant colors that conveyed storms within, untamed moods, dreams, and flashes of hope. Creativity became a language that bypassed intellectual defenses, speaking directly to the core of experience. The process stirred dormant joy, awakening a radical acceptance of imperfection as fertile ground for growth. In sharing this, I invite you to notice how your own emotional terrain yearns for acknowledgement. Consider moments when restraint seemed essential, but ask what opportunity awaited should you choose to lean in. Perhaps the raw edges of feeling carry the keys to a richer, more nuanced self. Our stories aren't written in steel, but in the softness of courage to show up fully, scars and all. It's within this brave vulnerability that genuine connection, both with others and ourselves, begins to flourish anew. Reflecting on this journey so far, I sense a quiet unfolding beneath the surface, a delicate weaving together of threads I hadn't fully recognized before. It's as if the landscape of who I am has been carved not by singular moments, but by countless, near imperceptible ripples that have shifted the ground beneath me over time. These ripples, born from a mix of courage and hesitance, fear and yearning, have created intricate patterns that guide my steps in ways I'm only beginning to grasp. In tracing these subtle contours, I've come to see the interplay of light and shadow within myself more clearly. There is an undercurrent humming softly, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a surge, that pulses through the spaces where identity and survival converge. Like a river bending around unseen stones, I realize how fluid and malleable the sense of self truly is. What once seemed like a fortress built for protection now reveals fissures where possibility seeps in. Those constructs that once felt permanent appear more like living entities, shaped and reshaped through our emotions and stories. Yesterday, as I wandered into the fading glow of twilight, I ran into an old acquaintance who remarked on how much I seemed to have changed. His words stirred a mixture of resistance and acceptance inside me. Change is an uneasy friend, especially when it intimates that parts of what we believe to be us are shifting beneath our feet. But maybe this metamorphosis is less about loss and more about unveiling layers that have patiently waited, like petals tightly furled, hesitant to bloom until the time felt right. I recall a moment late last week when I caught my reflection in a rain-speckled window. For a split second, the image felt foreign, yet familiar, a quiet reminder that transformation often dances just at the edges of perception, teasing us with glimpses before revealing itself fully. Past and present collided in that single frame, reminding me that who we are is continuously being written, erased, and rewritten through the lens of experience and awareness. As I sit with these insights, I feel an invitation to lean into the tension between comfort and growth. It's a place both sacred and unsettling, like standing at the shoreline where waves perpetually kiss the sand, each retreat inviting a new advance. The rhythms of retreat and approach echo within, navigating the territory between protective patterns and surrendered authenticity. Sometimes, when I catch the faintest trace of hesitation before stepping forward, I imagine a child hesitating at the edge of a vast playground, curious but cautious, eager yet unsure. That image reminds me how courage often wears the guise of quiet persistence. It's the gentlest force that nudges us beyond familiar boundaries, reshaping what we believed unchallengeable. What strikes me most is how these internal shifts ripple outward, touching the way I converse, connect, and create space for others and myself. Growth doesn't demand uprooting everything at once. It invites a soft unspooling, a tender peeling back of layers that held stories long told, but perhaps only half understood. The horizon stretches wider, colors becoming more vivid, textures richer, though every step forward mingles with whispers of uncertainty. In sitting with this evolving picture, I find an emerging sense of spaciousness, a kind of quiet breathing room where complexity is embraced rather than feared. It's a realm where contradictions live side by side, without forcing resolution, where vulnerability is not weakness, but a trace of profound strength that pulses beneath the surface. Looking ahead, there's a weightless anticipation humming inside me, not of dramatic upheaval, but of gentle dawns breaking over familiar terrain. This space between who I've been and who I'm becoming holds a sacred tension, a charged stillness pregnant with possibility. It is here that the journey, rich with discovery, invites a continuation, an opening to what lies beyond the familiar contours etched by years of protective habit. We stand on the precipice of something quietly transformative. The path forward is winding and tender, demanding both patience and audacity to traverse. Within this unfolding, I sense a soft, steady pulse beckoning us toward a deeper resonance, a call that recognizes the beauty in embracing the full spectrum of self, beyond scripts written by survival. This moment hums with the possibility of emergence, as though the air itself holds a promise waiting to be claimed, not through force or surrender alone, but through the delicate dance of becoming that only time and gentle intention can reveal. There's a quiet resilience that settles within me now, a steady flame flickering gently through the spaces where doubt once loomed large. It's not a loud proclamation or a grand revelation, but a subtle, unwavering knowing that who I truly am cannot be confined to patterns woven from fear. I can feel it seep through the smallest cracks, when I ease the grip on control, when I let a conversation breathe without rehearsed words, when vulnerability slides into my gaze like an unspoken invitation. This resilience is a gentle defiance, a soft insistence that life's fullness beckons beyond the cages anxiety has sketched around my spirit. I recall a recent evening by the river where the sky melted into shades of indigo and burnished gold. The water's surface reflected the fading light, rippling effortlessly with the breeze's gentle coaxing. At that moment, I sat in a state of stillness, recognizing how many years I had lived with defenses so tightly embraced that I scarcely allowed myself to feel the wind's invitation. The river didn't resist its flow, nor did it fear the shifting tides. It surrendered in fluid grace. I understood then that I could embody that fluidity, that movement, allowing parts of me once folded away to unfold and join the dance of light and shadow. This awareness isn't a destination reached, but an evolving journey, one where the traps of avoidance begin to loosen, replaced by an emerging willingness to trust my instincts, to welcome discomfort as a messenger rather than a menace. I can name the quiet voice that urges retreat, but I also recognize the voice that encourages reaching out, leaning in, stepping closer to the edges I once skirted. There is a tension here, charged yet tender, like roots stretching cautiously beneath thawing ground, claiming earth with purposeful softness. In walking this path, I've seen how the dance between adaptation and authenticity is less about choosing one over the other, and more about weaving them into a rich tapestry that honors the stories anxiety etched before I could name them. Through this weaving, I begin to perceive that the self is not a fixed sculpture but a living mosaic, shifting with every breath and encounter. It carries echoes of survival and seeds of becoming, fragile yet fierce, broken yet whole. Sometimes, when quietness settles around me like a familiar shawl, I remind myself that silence can hold as much wisdom as speech, that solitude can nurture as deeply as connection. Yet, I also feel the stirrings beneath those still moments, curiosities untamed, passions whispered, truths half-glimpsed. They beckon me forward, coaxing me away from the plateau of comfort toward peaks where voice and vulnerability intertwine. The hero of this unfolding story is not a distant figure or idealized version, but the me that shows up despite shadows and cracks. The me who, with trembling hands and tentative heart, learns to loosen the reins of fear, discovering that the world beyond anxiety's muster is wide and wild and waiting. I carry this image with me. A person standing at the edge of a forest, sunlight filtering through leaves, hesitant at first, but willing to step deeper into the unknown, trusting that roots run strong beneath the shifting soil. I invite us all to consider the masks worn and the scripts repeated, to honor the courage it takes to recognize when those costumes no longer fit the dance we long to join. It takes grace to meet ourselves in these quiet reckonings, patience to untangle threads woven through years, and faith to imagine a self less guarded, more expansive. Ultimately, I believe this transformation is a whisper of homecoming, a return not to some distant ideal, but to the essence of who we were before fear pinned its margins around our lives. It's an embrace of imperfection as the language of truth, openness as the path to healing, and presence as the seed from which authentic identity blooms. So as I step forward, I carry a soft invitation for you as well, to journey toward the light beyond defense, to gently question the contours shaped by anxious survival, and to listen deeply for the quiet voice of your own becoming. In this unfolding story, we are the brave writers, the courageous explorers, and the tender gardeners of the self, tending the garden of possibility where our truest colors can pulse and shine.